It's lovely to be back in Mount Merrion. I love it here. It holds a special place in my heart. I grew up here and I went to school here. For years I taught in the school here, but most importantly, when I was just a wee girl, somebody told me about the cross here, just in the room next door, and that's where I gave my life to Jesus. So it took a while for all that to work itself out, but definitely very much part of my faith journey, so it's very special that I'm back. I work at the moment, I'm an evangelist in the Diocese of Down-Tramore. It's a bit of a mouthful, but really all that means is I get to tell people, I get to carry good news to other people and tell them about the cross as well and what Jesus has done for them. So that's really who I am. I'm going to just pop this down here. You'll not be offended if I put the good book on down here. Okay. Walking in obedience is, the pursuit of obedience is what that passage is about. And it's way back in the Old Testament, but it's still really, really relevant to us today. Because at this time in their history, the people of God in that time are just about to enter into a brand new phase in their history with God. For generations before, God has promised them that He is going to bring them into a good land. And they're going to inherit and be planted in that land, and they're going to grow into a strong community of those who love the Lord. And Moses, who's the leader at the time, those are his words that we just heard read. He is reminding the people of God's faithfulness and His goodness and how He has already brought them out of the land of Egypt. Do you remember that miraculous exodus where they had to cross the river and it dried up before them? And they've been wandering about in the wilderness for a long time, and He's been providing for them miraculously there as well for many, many years. And right now, Moses is coming to the end of his life on earth. The people are about to enter into a new phase of coming into this promised land, and they're about to also receive a new leader as well. So there's quite a lot of change happening. And sometimes, when we are going through seasons of change, but even when we're not, we need to be just reminded, don't we, of how good God is and His faithfulness over the years to us. So Moses is kind of standing in this place in the history of the people of God on the cusp of something new. And he doesn't just say, there it is over there, you know what to do, on you go and get it, have a good time, enjoy. He's using the opportunity to kind of reset a little thing in them and to remind them of God's goodness, but also of something else that's really, really important. You see, there is a bit of a renewal happening in this passage. Moses is reminding the people of something called a covenant, which is an agreement that he had made with them generations before. And he has kept having to remind them of this agreement and this covenant the whole way through their time with him. And the thing is, with the promises of this lovely covenant, with the promises of His goodness and His faithfulness and His kindness comes responsibility as well. It's not a one-sided covenant. You can't have a one-sided covenant. If you're going to make an agreement with somebody, then it involves somebody else. And this is what's happening. The people need to agree to respond to His faithfulness in return. And the way that they do that is by loving Him, by listening to Him, and by obeying the things that He is asking them to do. So Moses is reminding them, this is not one-sided. God's faithfulness is right there in front of you. His promise is there. But come on, what's our part? What's your part? And that's what's happening in the passage. Standing on the threshold of something new. Here's who God is. But here's what we're expected to be in response to that. And there's this amazing call to choose. See, God doesn't tend to force us to do things. He made us with the ability to choose. And He so much wants us to choose Him. He could make us do things, but that's not as hard as that we choose Him, because we see how good He is. And so Moses stands before them, and there's an urgency in what he says, and he knows that his time's short now. And so he sets out very clear choice. It's stark. 2 paths. And he says, choose. Because here's the choice. There only are 2. We either choose the way of life, which leads to blessing, or we choose the way of death, which leads to destruction. It's a bit heavy, isn't it? I have a daughter about to move out into her first place of her own, and within the next fortnight, hopefully. And do you know, if I were to give this speech to her as she's about to enter, she'd be looking at me, you know, and thinking, well, really, what's your problem? But I have had a few conversations about a good way to live with her, because I think that's what you do when you're on the cusp of something new. And Moses is saying this: choose life. Choose life. The passionate pursuit of obedience brings life. It really does, and we're going to try to unpack that a little bit. You see, the alternative, which is disobedience or not doing the things that God asks us to do, the alternative to life brings not life or death, depending on how you look at it. If the people love the Lord and do what he says, they'll have great blessing in their new life in the new land. But if they turn away from God, even just a little tiny bit, because little tiny bits tend to turn into bigger bits, then they'll face the consequences of that choice. And Moses doesn't want that for the people. He knows life's hard. Just normal everyday life's hard. But it gets harder if we choose to do that and not have God in the middle of it and not do things his way. You see, there's no middle ground. See, when you become a Christian, I'm so excited that people are becoming Christians out by Merrion. Well done, whoever you are. I bless you. It's amazing. And you're starting on this incredible journey with God. But when you come into that new life with God, there's no such thing as the spiritual equivalent of Switzerland, okay? There's no neutral ground here. You have to choose. I'm on God's side and I'm going his way. You can't kind of live in the middle. I'll have a wee bit of God and I'll do this as well. I'll have a wee bit of God, but actually I'll choose that bit. And, well, I like that bit from the Bible, but I'm not too fussed on that bit, so I'll not do that. It doesn't really work like that. You have to be all out and all in and follow the Lord in obedience to his word. And there's good reasons for that, which we're going to look at now. But it is a stark decision, death or life. Which one are you going to choose? The original Hebrew wording is close to this. Choose life on what's good versus death on what's wrong. It's that clear. And for most of us human beings, when we are in a healthy place of thinking, and sometimes we're not, because life hits us with things, but when we are in a good, healthy place of thinking, the urge to live and to survive is really strong in human beings. People go to great lengths to survive and to remain alive. But this choice that Moses presents is not about basic survival or just continuing to have a heart that beats. It's about how we live, how people are going to live. It's about how we live and what life is like moment by moment in the everyday. Not just in the big stuff of about to go into something new. Maybe some of you this morning are about to go into something new. Maybe there's something stirring in family. There's a change or a new job or a change of circumstance in where you live or something else that's going on. But even if you're not on the threshold of all of that, every little moment by moment thing that we choose today and tomorrow and the next day are going to determine whether we live in fullness of life or we don't. And that's really what Moses is saying. And the people listening to Moses would have been clear about what constitutes worship and a faithful lifestyle, because they're very familiar with the things God has been saying, and they'll have been constantly reminded about how to do that. And there might be some of you sitting today, and maybe you're thinking, because sometimes I hear people say this sort of thing to me, and you might be thinking, well, is that not all a wee bit Old Testament? Do you know what? all the way through the Bible, right into the New Testament, and when Jesus is on the earth and in the early church and what comes after, the Bible consistently calls people who choose to follow Jesus to make a clear and an intentional choice to do the things that he asks us to do. It's how Jesus himself lived. I was just reading this morning in my own daily reading that Jesus learned obedience. This is Jesus. How much more do we need to learn this? Now, it's a journey. It's a journey we're on, and we need to learn to choose to do this. But every tiny decision adds into the bigger decision, so that when you have a big decision to make, if you're making good choices the whole way through, there's more chance you're going to make the good choice for the big things if you're already doing that in the little things. But we'll have to learn how to do it, and we'll have to practice it. And we're not going to get it right all the time, but it's important that we set our heart towards that, because that's really the key for this. Even Jesus himself tells us that he does what he sees the Father doing. He listens to what his Father's saying, and he does that. He's not living independently. And that's the thing. Sometimes we human beings, we want to live independently, don't we? We want a wee bit of Jesus, but not so much that it disrupts our way of life. But the thing is that often our way of life is really a way of death, because it's not the best way. It's really not. So verses 16 to 20 in the reading today tell us that the choice is about this. I'm just putting it in my own words. Love God, walk in his ways, keep his commandments. And that's repeated later on in verse 20, slightly differently presented. Love God, hear God's voice, cling to God. Cling to God. You see, the people listening to this when Moses was talking would have understood that the hearing God's voice part is not, in those days, the words for hearing, it was the same as doing. So you don't just hear and listen. You then do something with that. Because sometimes we kind of hear and we listen and then we just kind of go on and do our own thing, don't we? But for these people, they knew what that meant. It's hearing and doing are like that. They're just stuck together. If you hear something and God says, here's how it is, here's the best way, then you do that. So they would have understood that that's what it is. And it's a living with everything you are and everything you have kind of experience. It's pursuing obedience is about being and doing. It's really, really important that we do both. Hearing what he says and doing that. Obedience is from the word to hear. It's the same thing in the essence of what Moses is telling the people in this passage. And I don't know what you think of, what comes into your head when you hear the word obedience. But I would imagine if I had the time to go around the room, there'd be all sorts of different things. And I don't know, does it sound a bit stiff? Like obedience, I don't like the word obedience. It's very, it's like a dog or something being trained to do things, or, blindly doing something that you haven't thought about. It's not a word that we're comfortable with. But the original meaning of that word is different. It's hearing what God's saying and doing that, because that's the way to live. That's the way to have fullness of life. It's about whether you're going to be in a relationship or a covenant or an agreement with God, or you're going to do life without him. Because that's what covenant is. And you see, God has already made a choice. His choice is already made. Did you know that he's chosen you? God has chosen each one of you because he wants to be in a relationship with you. That's what this is all about. And he says something like this, I choose you, I choose you. And we can do life together. Or you cannot be in relationship with me and do life on your own, but that's not going to go well for you. That's going to lead into things that are not good for you. Because you'll find that there are others around who influence you, and they don't really care about you, but they'll want the resource that you have. Or they'll want the allegiance that you want to give, and they'll steal things away from you. That's what other things do. That's why our hearts have to stay close to God. That's why we have to cling to him. Because it's so easy for us to get distracted and pulled into those other things, but it never leads to life. Moses is saying, remember, the covenant. Remember, God's already chosen you. But now it's your turn to commit in response to him. And sometimes we all need a wee reminder of that. I need loads of reminders of that. We need to make a fresh decision, even today, even in the moment we're sitting in, what we're going to do and how we're going to live. You see, if you choose life, it's going to affect every decision that you make. Because you can't be in a relationship with God. You can't say you're following Jesus. You can't be a Christian and live like those who aren't. It's not just something you believe in your head. It affects everything in your life. And in the context of the passage that was just read for us, that would be nations like the Egyptians and the Assyrians and the Canaanites. You live differently. If you know Jesus and you're getting to know Jesus, you live differently. We live differently. And we might read this Old Testament law stuff from this particular era, and we don't always understand it because it was a different time and a different culture. And so sometimes we read this and we're more worried about, feeling sorry for those people who they couldn't even have a bacon butty. I mean, how awful is that? And that's kind of how we read this. But in reality, the other nations of this era that this is written in, they're sitting and they're probably thinking, look at those people. They don't even have to sacrifice their little ones in the fire for their God. They don't have to work themselves up into some sort of frenzy to see if they can get an answer from the God they serve. Sometimes we don't get that. We see something tiny and we hook onto that because it's not culturally relevant to us. And we miss the point. You see, the point is through God's ways, God's people, his church, us, have the opportunity to live free from all those foolish and evil practices and the injustices that plague other societies on the earth, even today. Through God's ways, God's people are the salt and the light in a bland and a dark, dark world. And by obeying God's ways, here's what I've discovered. Being in the new covenant, which I'm so pleased with because I think I'd have been awful in the other one. But when we live in obedience to God, we take steps towards the kingdom of God, his rule and reign, breaking into our world. And what I mean by that is, when we do the kind of things that he tells us to do now, things happen. When you open up your church building and you have a party, and you share the light and the love of God with people through the food that you have and the things that you do, that brings something of the kingdom of God into this community. People see a different way to live, a different way to be, a different way to think even. And they are attracted and they are drawn to that. And that's why God is going to keep growing your church and adding people to you and giving you new Christians to look after. Because people are going to see there's something different about these people. They don't just say they believe this and it's all in their heads, but they're doing life differently. They're obeying. They're doing something that is not the same as all the other people who live in this place. How passionate we are about pursuing God is reflected in all those wee choices that we make. And we don't want to do blind, we don't want to read the books of the law in the Old Testament and sort of blindly follow some of that today, because some of it isn't, it's like, the example that I just given you, it isn't for us, and we would miss the moment we live in, but we do need to know how to translate that into our modern world today. And Jesus said, he tried to sum up, didn't he, the commandments, and he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength, with everything. In other words, love God. That's the first thing. And then love your neighbor. And that's the second thing. And if we live like that, then we're beginning to follow Jesus. He doesn't follow us. Sometimes I have seen people struggle really when they become Christians because they think that following Jesus means you just kind of add him in to where you're at. And it might be a process of not everything changes instantly, but he doesn't follow us, we follow him. So there's going to be a bit of a turnaround for most of us on how we're doing things, isn't there? There's going to be a big change. Choosing life's about heart work. It's about that. And often our hearts are tugged at and drawn away. So Moses is reminding these people on the cusp of something new. Sort your hearts out again. Come on, where are we at? Are we going to follow Jesus and do things his way, or are we not? Life and death, blessing and curse. Don't choose the way of the curse. But what even today is that? What is the curse anyway? You might be wondering, I don't know. Well, it's not just swear words, and it's not just the result of a dark spell. Those can be curse, but that's, in a biblical sense, to look at the curse, we need to go way back to Genesis, and I'm coming into land here. But in a nutshell, at the very beginning, God, we read the story in Genesis of God, this amazingly good, faithful God who creates people to know him and to live in fullness of life. And then there's an enemy who gets in the way. He was once the most beautiful created angel, but not content with that, he wanted to be worshipped as God was. And as he grew full of hate, he drew the people that God loved, the ones who bore his image, away from God. And he planted thoughts in their heads about God's goodness or lack of it. And he tried to get them to think that God isn't really that good and God isn't really that for them. Does God really love me? Is he just trying to keep me away from the good things? We all know that one, don't we? It's still something that he says to us today. Oh, you go ahead and do that. You'll be all right. Just do that anyway. You see, God just doesn't want you to enjoy yourself. So you can keep on doing that. It doesn't matter. It's the enemy's lie. And the thing is, what he's attacking in that is how good God is and whether God really loves us or not. And this breakdown in connection with God that happened in the beginning and the decay that began to happen all around people as well is known as the fall. And see the effects of that? That's what the curse is. The curse is when the people that God made, including you and me, try to seize blessing for ourselves apart from God and outside of relationship with him, where we're just trying to get a good life for ourselves and have nothing to do with God. Or at times we are even going against what we know God's moral laws are, God's ways are, because we might get what we want that way. That's living in curse. That's not good. It's not good for any of us to do that. But blessing is about flourishing and having fullness of life. And I know that in a room this size, there'd be people in this room, and you have been trying so hard to follow the way of life. You've been trying to do God's ways, and it's still really hard, isn't it? It's not an easy choice, but I promise you that if you stay choosing for God, choosing his ways, he will bring you into experiencing full life, really good life. He will do that for you. It is coming. It is coming. It doesn't always come in our time, but it comes. Don't try and seize something that you think might look easier or better without God. It will not work out well for you. And you know, the biggest blessing of all is that we get to be in relationship with God again. We get to be in covenant, in agreement with him because of what Jesus did for us. And Jesus has taken the effects of the fall and the curse. And because he died for us on the cross and he rose again from the dead, he's broken the effects of that. We don't have to live under the curse anymore. Isn't that good news? We don't actually have to live in all that stuff anymore. We can get to choose life and experience God's goodness. And there might be somebody here today, and you've been listening to other people having become Christians during the week, realize they need Jesus and they want to follow him. And maybe you're sitting today and you're thinking, well, I haven't done that either. And actually, I would like to experience life like that. And you can do that today. You just have to choose him and realize you need him and choose him. And if you do that today, we'd love we'd love you to tell somebody here that you trust, or somebody that you're with, so that they can encourage you and help you with that. Because what I love about Mount Merrion is they know how to celebrate. Do you know, honestly, not every church does. I don't know what's wrong with them, but you know how to do that. So when there's good news, you cheer and you clap and you encourage people, and it's amazing to hear that. So if you're choosing Jesus today for the first time, will you tell somebody so they get the opportunity to celebrate you? They're not embarrassed you, but they just want to celebrate. You might need to do something about that today. You see, if you read a little bit later on in the next book of the Bible in Joshua, the people of Israel, God's people come to another point. They've been going through the land. It hasn't been easy. They do get into the land promised, but it hasn't been easy. They're having to fight big giants and scary things, and that's why they need to keep their heart in the right place. So they're not drawn aside, or they're not tempted to follow after one of these boyos who are not wanting to lead them into good things. And Joshua, who's their leader he then has to remind them again, when it comes to the end of his leadership, you need to choose today who you're going to serve. He says to them, you need to choose today, life, death, who you're going to serve. And then he says, as for me and for my household, the people around me, we're going to choose to follow the Lord. And maybe today we need to remind ourselves of that and choose to do that again. We still have to be reminded to choose. I'm just going to finish with a really quick story, and then we're going to move into a time of communion together. I was doing door-to-door outreach one day, and not that far away from here, and I knocked a door. It's somebody else with me. I knocked a door, and before the door opened, this big blast of something was coming at the door. I could hear it was like some big giant beast was throwing itself off the door. It sounded like it must have been a cow size at least. It was that big, but it clearly wasn't. When the door opened, there was like a bit of a ferocious looking dog, and it was like snarling and growling. And this happens to me a lot when I'm out and about. But the lady who opened the door, you know, you'd have thought she was expecting us to arrive, and she just invited us in, and she said, come on in, the dog will not touch you. Is the dog? And I'm thinking, okay. So she brings us inside, and she's very hospitable. She sits us down, and without even asking, she goes off to make us a drink. And meanwhile, the dog has leapt onto the chair and then onto a little table. And as I'm like this, eyeballing the dog's eyeballing me, and I'm trying to be really cool and not look like I'm a bit afraid, but I was. And so in my trying to make small talk with her, I say, and what's the dog's name? The dog's name is Angel. Which was ironic. And I'm thinking, okay. And I say, and what kind of a dog is this? And it was one of the kinds you're not supposed to have, okay, because they're quite vicious. So I'm thinking, that's not going well. Anyway, we had a cup of tea. I'm trying to ignore the dog who's here and drooling and snarling. And we had a good conversation. And as we started to talk about the Lord, and this lady was very broken. She had lots of things going on in her life, lots of things that were very difficult. But we began to talk about Jesus and how we don't have to live like this. And the Lord really started to come and to bless her. And you could feel the peace, and she had tears in her eyes. And at one point I said to her, is it okay? Could I just pray with you? And she said, oh, yes, that would be good. And so we prayed, and the dog is still snarling, you know, here. As I started to pray, and it was a simple prayer, but just simply asking the goodness of God to be present in the room, the dog suddenly got down off the table, and it lay on its back on the floor with its paws all up, just very calm and peaceful. And when we'd finished praying, she said to me, oh, it's like there's something really pure in the room. And what she was feeling was the presence of God in the room. And the dog was feeling something too. I just am convinced the dog was, because that was the first time the dog had stopped snarling and looking like it was about to have my arm for breakfast. Now, here's what I want to say to you, okay? It's not really about the story. But we sang a song there when we were worshiping, and there is going to be a day when every knee is going to bow before Jesus, everybody's going to recognize him for who he is. Everybody's going to recognize the goodness and the purity and the faithfulness. And every single person's going to bow the knee to Jesus. Here's the thing for us as God's people. We get to do that now. We get to choose that now. We're not going to be made to bow the knee one day because we've been practicing that. We've been choosing that. All those little tiny decisions you're making that are really hard, we're choosing bowing the knee to Jesus in a way that other people may not have the choice to do. But they're still going to have to do it anyway because they're going to recognize who he is. So today, here's the choice for us again. And we're going to choose the way of life. Or we're going to just kind of meander along doing our own thing. Dipping in and out of the way of life, but choosing a way that's not God's way. And today there is choice to be made.